A Crash in the Desert, 1947. On a hot July night in 1947, something tore through the skies above New Mexico. The desert air crackled with an unearthly energy as farmers, ranchers, and small-town residents looked up to see lights where none should have been. Roswell, a quiet town surrounded by miles of rugged terrain, was about to become the center of one of the most enduring mysteries in American history. It began with a sound. Some described it as a thunderous boom, others as the roar of an explosion. Mac Brazel, a rancher tending sheep near the desolate stretch of land, recalled being startled awake by the noise. The next morning, as he rode out across the fields, he stumbled upon something extraordinary. Strange metallic debris scattered across his land. The material was unlike anything he had seen before. It was light, flexible, yet impossible to burn or break. Some pieces were etched with odd symbols, markings that seemed to shimmer in the sunlight. Brazel's discovery would set off a chain of events that changed Roswell forever. At first, he told neighbors and friends about the debris, passing pieces around like relics from another world. They bent the material, crushed it, only to watch it spring back into shape as though defying the laws of physics. Word spread quickly, and soon the local sheriff was involved. Sheriff George Wilcox listened carefully as Brazel described the wreckage, then made a decision that would echo through history. He contacted the Roswell Army Airfield. Within hours, military officials descended upon the site. Trucks, jeeps, and uniformed men sealed off the area, their presence transforming a simple ranch into a forbidden zone. Brazel, once curious and open, now found himself surrounded by questions he could not answer. What was this material? Why did the military care so much? And most importantly, why were they determined to keep it quiet? On July 8, 1947, the Roswell Army Airfield issued a shocking press release. They had recovered a flying disc. The story hit newspapers across the country, igniting a frenzy. For the first time in American history, the possibility of extraterrestrial contact wasn't whispered in dark corners. It was printed in bold headlines. The Roswell Daily Record proclaimed, "Ross captures flying saucer on ranch in Roswell region." For one brief moment, the impossible seemed to have become undeniable. But just as quickly as the story had emerged, it began to unravel. Within 24 hours, the Army issued a retraction. The flying disc, they now claimed, was nothing more than a weather balloon. Photographs were released showing officers holding flimsy balloon fragments. The extraordinary reduced to the mundane. The press, confused and humiliated, was forced to retreat from its own sensational headlines. And the people of Roswell were left with a bitter taste of deception. Yet whispers refused to die. Witnesses insisted that what had been found was no ordinary balloon. Some spoke of large metallic structures unlike any known aircraft. Others claimed to have seen bodies, small, humanoid figures quickly whisked away under tarps by the military. The contradictions only deepened the mystery, planting seeds of suspicion that would grow for decades. For Roswell, the desert crash was no longer just a local curiosity. It was the beginning of a cultural phenomenon. Questions multiplied. Had humanity made contact with visitors from the stars? Or had the government staged the greatest cover-up of the century? The answers lay buried in the sands of New Mexico, guarded by secrecy and silence. But one truth was already certain. The Roswell incident had forever altered the way America looked at the skies. The rancher's discovery. In the days following the strange crash, rancher Mac Brazel became an unlikely figure in one of the world's most puzzling sagas. Brazel was an ordinary man, accustomed to the rhythms of ranch life. Early mornings, sheep tending, an evening spent in the quiet solitude of the New Mexico desert. Yet on that morning in July 1947, his routine was shattered by the sight of debris spread across a wide expanse of his property. The field was littered with fragments of an unknown craft. The material seemed almost alive. Neighbors recalled handling the debris and being stunned at its qualities. Impossibly light, resistant to damage, and oddly elastic. Some claimed you could crumple it into a ball, only for it to unfurl back to its original shape without a crease. Among the shards, there were beams that appeared metallic, marked with strange purple and violet symbols that looked like writing but belonged to no known language. Brazel, baffled and disturbed, knew that this was no ordinary wreckage. Unsure of what to do, Brazel first shared his discovery with a few locals. Among them were neighbors who encouraged him to alert the authorities. At first, he hesitated. After all, what farmer wanted to invite the military onto his land? But as word spread, curiosity became concern. The sheriff's office in Roswell soon heard of the debris and sent out deputies to investigate. Sheriff George Wilcox himself would later confirm that Brazel arrived at his office carrying a box of the mysterious material. According to accounts, the sheriff handled the debris with awe, noting its unearthly resilience. It was Wilcox who decided that the Roswell Army airfield had to be contacted. Within hours, military personnel arrived at the ranch. They spoke little, asked few questions, and instead focused on gathering every scrap of debris they could find. Soldiers filled trucks with the wreckage, moving quickly and methodically as if following precise orders. To Brazel's dismay, they told him to remain silent. The rancher, once fascinated, now felt trapped in a drama far larger than himself. Soon after, Brazel's life changed drastically. Reports surfaced that he had been detained by the military for several days. Some suggested he was held against his will, pressured to change his story. When he emerged, Brazel appeared withdrawn and cautious, repeating the official line, "It was nothing more than a weather balloon." Those who knew him insisted he was never the same again. His enthusiasm gone, his words carefully measured. The discovery had shaken not only a rancher, but also the community around him. The people of Roswell were left with whispers and suspicions, wondering why a simple balloon would require armed soldiers, sealed perimeters, and enforced silence. The rancher's discovery had triggered a chain reaction, one that would draw the eyes of the world to a small desert town and ignite the first sparks of a legend that would burn for decades. The first press release. On July 8, 1947, the Roswell Army Airfield made history with a single announcement that sent shockwaves across the globe. In an era when newspapers were the heartbeat of information, the words chosen by the military would ignite a firestorm that has never truly gone out. The press release, authorized by Public Information Officer Walter Haut, was straightforward and shocking. It declared that the Army had recovered a flying disc from a ranch near Roswell. The phrasing was deliberate, chosen to match the growing fascination with flying saucers that had been sweeping the nation in the summer of 1947. Only weeks earlier, pilots across the United States had reported mysterious discs skimming across the skies, fueling headlines and public anxiety. Now the Army itself was confirming such an object had been found. When the Roswell Daily Record ran the headline, "RAAF captures flying saucer on ranch in Roswell region," the town erupted. Curiosity seekers gathered near the Army base, eager to glimpse proof of what they had long suspected, that we were not alone. Radio stations buzzed with speculation, and national newspapers carried the story alongside political crises and war news. For a moment, Roswell was no longer an obscure desert town. It was the epicenter of a cosmic revelation. The language of the release left little room for doubt. A disk, not debris, not balloon remnants, but a craft. Journalists latched onto the statement, and by evening, editors in New York and Chicago were demanding more details. What did it look like? How large was it? Who had seen it? The questions multiplied faster than the Army could answer. To the people of Roswell, the press release validated the rumors circulating since Mac Brazel's discovery. They whispered that the strange debris had already been hauled away in trucks, that strange symbols had been seen on the wreckage, and that military men had spoken in hushed tones of something unprecedented. The official announcement seemed to confirm their worst and most thrilling suspicions. Yet behind the bold headlines, the Army seemed strangely unprepared for the public reaction. Within hours of the story breaking, phone lines at the Roswell base were overwhelmed. Calls came in from reporters, civilians, and even government officials in Washington, D.C. The excitement was electric, and the implications staggering. If the Army had indeed recovered a flying disc, then the world as people knew it was about to change. But even as newspapers rolled off the presses with history-making headlines, forces were already at work to put the genie back in the bottle. The first press release, while brief, had cracked open a door to a new reality. What came next would slam it shut just as quickly, leaving confusion, suspicion, and a mystery that would outlive nearly everyone involved. The retraction. If the initial press release was a spark that ignited the flames of belief, the retraction that followed was a bucket of cold water meant to smother it. On July 9, 1947, barely 24 hours after newspapers across the country declared that the U.S. Army had captured a flying disc, the story changed dramatically. The Army now insisted that the object found near Roswell was nothing more than a weather balloon. The sudden shift stunned the public. Photographs were released to accompany the new explanation. In them, Brigadier General Roger Ramey, commander of the 8th Air Force, posed in his office with debris that appeared utterly unremarkable: torn rubber, flimsy sticks, and metallic foil. The extraordinary had been reduced to the ordinary. Editors across the country scrambled to rewrite their stories, replacing visions of alien craft with the dull reality of meteorological equipment. For many, the retraction rang hollow. The debris shown in Ramey's office looked nothing like the strange materials described by Mac Brazel and others who had handled it. Witnesses had spoken of metals that would not burn or bend, of beams marked with strange hieroglyphic-like symbols. Now, the official story told them those memories were false, or worse, that they had imagined it all. The military's handling of Brazel himself deepened suspicion. After his initial discovery, he had been outspoken, freely discussing the strange wreckage with neighbors and the press. But once the Army stepped in, Brazel's tone changed. He told reporters that he regretted ever mentioning the debris, and repeated the official line that it was nothing more than balloon fragments. Those who knew him best claimed he appeared frightened, as though pressured into silence. The retraction also created a narrative whiplash. One day, the Army confirmed a flying disc. The next, it dismissed the entire matter as a mistake. Journalists who had trumpeted the discovery now found themselves embarrassed. Some apologized to readers, while others hinted at darker motives, suggesting that the Army had deliberately misled the public to cover something up. If the intent of the retraction was to calm the storm, it failed. Instead, it birthed a new suspicion that the government had something extraordinary to hide. For decades to come, conspiracy theorists would point to this moment as the true beginning of the Roswell cover-up. The idea that the U.S. military might have discovered proof of alien life and then concealed it became the foundation of modern UFO mythology. In hindsight, the retraction accomplished little beyond fueling decades of debate. For believers, it was evidence that the Army was hiding the truth. For skeptics, it was a reminder of how quickly sensationalism could overwhelm fact. But for everyone, it left a bitter aftertaste. If the first announcement was wrong, why had it been made at all? And if the second announcement was right, why did it feel so unconvincing? Witnesses speak out. Even as the military tried to shut the story down, Roswell refused to stay silent. In the days and weeks following the retraction, witnesses, ordinary townspeople, ranchers, and even some base personnel began to share their own accounts. Their voices added new layers to the mystery, contradicting the official narrative and fueling suspicions that something extraordinary had truly occurred. Neighbors of Mac Brazel recalled seeing the strange debris firsthand. They described foil-like sheets that would crumple but instantly return to their original form. Children who handled the material spoke of its feather-light weight, so different from any earthly metal they had ever touched. Some insisted that beams recovered from the wreckage were inscribed with markings, strange geometric patterns that resembled no language they knew. The more they talked, the clearer it became that the Army's explanation of a weather balloon didn't fit the evidence they had seen with their own eyes. Other stories were more chilling. Rumors circulated of bodies recovered alongside the wreckage. Small, fragile figures covered quickly by tarps and transported under heavy guard. Though no photographs surfaced to prove the claims, the whispers spread like wildfire. One nurse at the Roswell Army Airfield was said to have confided to friends that she had seen something she could never forget: creatures that were not human. Within days, she disappeared, allegedly transferred without explanation. Military personnel, too, played a role in the spreading uncertainty. Some soldiers, perhaps against orders, quietly admitted that what had been recovered was no ordinary balloon. One officer claimed to have seen a large metallic structure loaded onto a truck in the dead of night. Others recalled being warned in no uncertain terms never to speak of what they had witnessed, under threat of court-martial or worse. The secrecy only strengthened the belief that the government was hiding something monumental. For the citizens of Roswell, the contradictions became impossible to ignore. On one hand, the government assured them that the mystery was solved. On the other, friends and neighbors insisted they had seen the impossible. The tension between official silence and local testimony planted seeds of distrust that would grow for decades, not only in Roswell, but across America, as the public began to suspect that their government was not telling the whole truth. The witnesses' voices, though often dismissed as hearsay, became the lifeblood of the Roswell legend. Without them, the story might have faded as just another military miscommunication. But their persistence, their willingness to defy silence, kept the mystery alive. It was their testimony that transformed Roswell from an isolated event into a global question. What really crashed in the desert that night? Military secrecy. As rumors swirled in Roswell and beyond, the behavior of the U.S. military only deepened the sense of mystery. From the moment they arrived at Mac Brazel's ranch, soldiers and officers operated with a level of secrecy that seemed out of proportion for a mere weather balloon. Every action suggested urgency, control, and a determination to seize not only the wreckage, but also the narrative itself. Locals who ventured near the debris field were turned away by armed guards. Trucks loaded with wreckage rumbled through town at night, headed for destinations unknown. Residents recalled the eerie sight of headlights cutting through the desert darkness, convoys moving as if in the middle of a war zone. Some claimed they saw covered crates, too large to be simple balloon parts, hauled away under heavy guard. The message was clear: civilians were not welcome. And curiosity would not be tolerated. Mac Brazel himself, once at the center of the story, seemed to vanish from public view. Neighbors whispered that he had been taken into custody by the military, held for days while officers questioned him about the debris. When he re-emerged, his story had changed. Gone was the excited rancher who spoke of strange metals and unbreakable material. In his place stood a cautious man, repeating the official explanation of a weather balloon. Those who knew him believed he had been pressured into silence, his voice stifled by the weight of military authority. Even the press was not immune to the clampdown. Reporters who had rushed to Roswell hoping for the story of the century found themselves stonewalled. Army officials refused interviews, issued bland statements, and discouraged further questions. Photographers who tried to capture images near the crash site were escorted away. For a profession built on access and information, the wall of silence was as infuriating as it was suspicious. Behind the scenes, secrecy reached even higher levels. Rumors circulated that wreckage had been flown to Wright Field in Ohio, a hub for experimental aircraft research. Some insisted the material was studied in hidden labs, while others believed it was immediately walked away, classified beyond reach. Military men stationed in Roswell told their families never to speak of what they had seen, warning that consequences would be severe. The clampdown was thorough, as if orchestrated from the very top. To the people of Roswell, the secrecy was damning. If the wreckage had truly been nothing more than a balloon, why the overwhelming military response? Why the intimidation, the arrests, the guarded convoys, the silence imposed on civilians? Each unanswered question gave rise to another, and with every whisper, suspicion grew stronger. In trying to shut down the story, the military had only made it bigger. What began as a crash in the desert was rapidly transforming into something far larger, a national mystery steeped in secrecy. The military may have hoped to close the book on Roswell with their retraction, but their very actions were writing a different narrative, one that would endure for generations. Cold War context. To understand the Roswell incident, one must consider the era in which it occurred. The summer of 1947 was not only a time of peace following World War II, but also the dawn of a new and uncertain age, the Cold War. Suspicion, secrecy, and the race for technological supremacy were at the forefront of national concerns. Against this backdrop, the crash in the New Mexico desert took on dimensions that extended far beyond simple curiosity about the skies. The United States had just emerged from the devastation of a global war, armed with nuclear weapons and determined to maintain dominance. At the same time, the Soviet Union was rapidly advancing its own military and scientific capabilities. Each nation watched the other with paranoia, expecting espionage, sabotage, or technological breakthroughs that could tip the balance of power. In this climate, anything unusual, especially strange wreckage in a desert, was treated not only as a scientific mystery, but as a potential threat to national security. Flying saucers, as they were popularly called, had already entered the public imagination. In June 1947, just weeks before Roswell, pilot Kenneth Arnold reported seeing 9 shiny objects darting across the skies near Mount Rainier. His account, widely publicized, sparked a wave of similar reports across the country. By July, Americans were primed to believe that strange craft might be watching them from above. But to the military, such sightings carried another, more earthly implication. They could be advanced Soviet aircraft or experimental weapons. The Cold War lens helps explain the Army's swift and secretive response to Roswell. If the debris had even the faintest chance of being a Soviet device, it demanded immediate control. Allowing the public or press unrestricted access could risk exposing vulnerabilities, or worse, provide clues to foreign spies about American defenses. What might have seemed to civilians like paranoia was to military leaders a matter of survival. The political climate also shaped the way the retraction unfolded. Admitting to the recovery of a flying disc was not only sensational, it carried geopolitical weight. If such an object truly existed, and if the United States had it in its possession, the implications for global power were staggering. Walking back the claim within 24 hours may have been less about silencing UFO rumors and more about preventing the Soviet Union from panicking or retaliating. Roswell was not just about aliens or balloons. It was about a world teetering on the edge of a new kind of conflict, one fought not only with weapons, but with information, perception, and secrecy. The crash in New Mexico occurred at the precise moment when America's obsession with flying saucers collided with its fear of the Soviet threat. That intersection would define not only Roswell, but much of the UFO phenomenon for decades to come. Through the lens of history, the Cold War context explains why Roswell could never be a simple story. Every action taken by the military, every contradiction in the press, every whisper from a witness, all were magnified by the paranoia of the age. In 1947, the world was learning that the skies were no longer just a frontier of exploration. They were a battlefield of secrets, and Roswell was one of its first flashpoints. Alternative explanations. As the years passed and the legend of Roswell grew, skeptics and researchers alike sought explanations that might demystify the crash without resorting to extraterrestrial visitors. While the popular imagination embraced the idea of a flying saucer, other theories, some mundane, others still shrouded in secrecy, offered alternative narratives that were just as intriguing. The official explanation, repeated over the decades, was that the debris came from a weather balloon. In the 1990s, the U.S. Air Force clarified further, claiming the wreckage was part of Project Mogul, a top-secret program designed to detect Soviet nuclear tests. These balloons carried sensitive microphones and radar reflectors, and their unusual materials may have seemed alien to anyone unfamiliar with classified military technology. If true, this explanation suggested the secrecy around Roswell was less about extraterrestrials and more about protecting Cold War intelligence efforts. Skeptics also pointed to the era's fascination with flying saucers. Kenneth Arnold's famous sighting weeks earlier had set the stage for a nationwide craze. Psychologists argued that the cultural climate primed witnesses to interpret strange debris through the lens of UFOs. A balloon or aircraft crash, in this view, became a saucer in the minds of those desperate to explain the unexplainable. Others, however, saw darker possibilities. Some suggested the wreckage was from an experimental aircraft, perhaps part of the military's rapid post-war push into jet and rocket technologies. If such a craft had crashed, the government would have been eager to conceal it, not only to protect secrets from the Soviets, but to prevent public panic over untested, dangerous projects. Witness reports of metallic materials and unrecognizable symbols could fit with prototypes that blended advanced engineering with unconventional designs. More conspiratorial theories pointed to human experimentation. A few researchers speculated that the so-called bodies seen by witnesses were not aliens at all, but victims of clandestine tests or accidents involving high-altitude flights. Though lacking firm evidence, this theory gained traction in the 1990s, when revelations about secret Cold War experiments fueled distrust in official explanations. Yet even the skeptics could not fully explain away the contradictions. If Roswell was merely a balloon crash, why did the Army initially announce the recovery of a flying disc? Why did witnesses consistently describe materials and symbols that did not match any known technology? And why did the military enforce such intense secrecy if the wreckage was mundane? Alternative explanations may have offered rational answers, but none erased the lingering doubts. For many, the very existence of multiple theories only underscored the mystery. Roswell remained not just a puzzle of what fell to Earth, but of why the truth seemed forever just out of reach. The birth of UFO culture. While the Army tried to bury the Roswell story under official denials, something far larger was taking shape. The summer of 1947 had already primed the public for tales of flying saucers, and the Roswell crash became the seed from which modern UFO culture would grow. Even as headlines shifted back to politics and world affairs, the whispers in New Mexico refused to die, and soon they spread everywhere. For the American public, Roswell symbolized more than just a crash. It represented a new frontier of mystery and possibility. If the Army had truly recovered something unearthly, then humanity was no longer alone. This idea electrified the imagination, inspiring books, pulp magazines, and late-night radio shows to speculate about visitors from the stars. Science fiction, already a popular genre, now seemed to echo reality in ways that felt both thrilling and terrifying. In the 1950s, as the Cold War intensified, UFO sightings multiplied. Strange lights in the sky, odd radar contacts, and reports from commercial and military pilots all fed into a growing belief that Roswell had been the beginning of a hidden truth. Public fascination with extraterrestrials surged, and the term flying saucer became shorthand for an entire cultural movement. Comic books and films like The Day the Earth Stood Still mirrored the anxieties and hopes born from Roswell. Roswell also gave rise to the first organized UFO research groups. Civilian investigators began collecting reports, cataloging sightings, and demanding government transparency. To them, Roswell was proof that the authorities were withholding information, and every new sighting was seen through the lens of the cover-up narrative. Organizations like NICAP, National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, would later cite Roswell as a key turning point in the UFO mystery. By the 1960s, Roswell had achieved a kind of mythic status. Though it had faded from mainstream headlines, within UFO circles it was considered the original case, the genesis of an era when humanity first brushed against the unknown. The secrecy, the contradictions, and the whispers of alien bodies ensured it never truly left the public imagination. Even as skepticism persisted, the legend of Roswell continued to grow, reshaping American culture and embedding itself in the very idea of the UFO phenomenon. What began as wreckage in the desert had become something much greater, a cultural symbol of mystery, distrust, and cosmic wonder. The birth of UFO culture was inseparable from Roswell, and every sighting, every rumor, every conspiracy theory that followed could trace its lineage back to that hot July night in 1947. the alien body allegations. Perhaps the most enduring and controversial aspect of the Roswell story is the claim that bodies were recovered from the crash site. For many, these allegations transformed Roswell from a simple mystery about strange debris into a profound question about humanity's place in the universe. Were we truly alone? Or had beings from beyond the stars met a tragic fate in the New Mexico desert? Accounts of bodies began to surface in the years after the incident, often whispered by locals or hinted at by former military personnel. Some witnesses claimed to have seen small humanoid figures at the site, their forms quickly concealed beneath tarps and loaded onto trucks. Others described morgue workers at Roswell Army Airfield receiving unusual orders, preparing for examinations unlike any they had ever conducted. One of the most famous stories came from Glenn Dennis, a mortician in Roswell at the time. In the 1990s, Dennis claimed that he had received a strange phone call from the base, asking about child-sized coffins and methods for preserving bodies exposed to the elements. Dennis further alleged that a nurse he knew confided in him about seeing beings that were not human. Shortly afterward, she vanished, transferred suddenly, never to be heard from again. Witnesses also spoke of secrecy surrounding flights out of Roswell in the days after the crash. Aircraft were said to have transported not only debris, but also biological remains to facilities such as Wright Field in Ohio, or even to hidden laboratories. The lack of photographs or physical proof did little to quash the rumors. If anything, the absence of evidence only deepened suspicions of a cover-up. The body's narrative was not without controversy. Skeptics argued that witnesses came forward decades after the event, their memories shaped by popular culture and the passage of time. Some suggested that the figures described were mannequins used in high-altitude parachute tests conducted in later years. Memories blurred and reassigned to 1947. The Air Force itself would eventually offer this as an explanation in official reports. Yet despite the doubts, the alien body allegations became a cornerstone of Roswell mythology. The idea that extraterrestrial beings had not only visited Earth, but perished here, gave the story a tragic and dramatic dimension. It was no longer just about technology, it was about life, death, and the possibility of contact between worlds. To this day, the question remains unresolved. Were the bodies real, or were they the inventions of memory, myth, and conspiracy? The truth, like so much of Roswell, lingers just out of reach, an enigma preserved in secrecy and shadows. The cover-up narrative. If Roswell is remembered today as the epicenter of UFO mythology, it is largely because of the enduring belief that the U.S. government orchestrated a massive cover-up. The shifting explanations, the enforced secrecy, and the intimidation of witnesses all painted a picture of an official effort to hide the truth, whether that truth involved extraterrestrial visitors, experimental technology, or something else entirely. The foundation of the cover-up narrative lies in the Army's own actions. On July 8, 1947, they told the world they had recovered a flying disc. On July 9th, they insisted it was only a balloon. This sudden reversal was more than just confusing. It was suspicious. Why make such a dramatic announcement in the first place, only to retract it within hours? For many, the most logical explanation was that the military had revealed too much too soon, and then scrambled to contain the fallout. Witness accounts reinforced this suspicion. Rancher Mac Brazel, once open and talkative, emerged from military custody sounding subdued, repeating the balloon story as though rehearsed. Reporters described his unease, his sudden reluctance to discuss the debris he had once shown so freely. Locals who had handled the wreckage were warned to remain silent, their testimonies brushed aside as unreliable. The message was clear. The official story was the only story. As the years went on, the secrecy only deepened. Files went missing, documents were classified, and photographs of the wreckage vanished. Researchers who sought military records often encountered gaps, conveniently, in the very years surrounding Roswell. These absences fueled the idea that the truth had been deliberately buried. The more the government insisted there was nothing to hide, the more convinced people became that something monumental was being concealed. The cover-up narrative also thrived on inconsistencies. Why did witnesses describe materials that resembled nothing like balloon fragments? Why did rumors of alien bodies persist despite official denials? And why, in the decades following Roswell, did the government repeatedly dismiss UFO sightings even when reported by trained pilots and radar operators? To believers, the answer was simple. The truth was too explosive to reveal. By the 1980s and 1990s, Roswell had become synonymous with government secrecy. Authors, journalists, and UFO researchers published books detailing alleged witness testimony, missing evidence, and patterns of deception. The crash was no longer just an isolated incident. It was framed as the cornerstone of a decades-long cover-up stretching from New Mexico to Washington, D.C. Theories ranged from secret pacts with extraterrestrials to the storage of alien craft and bodies at facilities like Area 51. The cover-up narrative endures because it fits a broader pattern of distrust. For generations, citizens have questioned whether their governments tell them the truth about war, technology, or surveillance. Roswell became the ultimate symbol of that distrust, a reminder that sometimes the most unbelievable explanation feels truer than the official story. And as long as questions remain unanswered, the cover-up theory will continue to thrive. Roswell in pop culture. By the time the 1960s rolled around, the Roswell story had already achieved legendary status within UFO circles. But it was in the following decades that Roswell transcended fringe interest and became a fixture of mainstream culture. From books to television, movies to music, Roswell was no longer just a mystery. It was a brand, a symbol of secrecy, aliens, and the possibility that humanity was not alone. In 1980, Charles Berlitz and William L. Moore published The Roswell Incident, the first major book to argue that aliens had indeed crashed in New Mexico and that the U.S. government had covered it up. The book revitalized the case, introducing it to a whole new generation and cementing Roswell as the centerpiece of UFO mythology. Soon, other authors and researchers followed, each adding new testimonies, theories, and contradictions to the growing legend. Hollywood quickly capitalized on the fascination. The 1990s saw a wave of films and TV shows that used Roswell as a backdrop for their narratives. Shows like The X-Files featured storylines inspired by Roswell, weaving government cover-ups and alien encounters into gripping drama. Movies like Independence Day and Roswell, the UFO cover-up, presented the crash as the spark for interstellar conflict and conspiracy. Even comedies like Men in Black couldn't resist referencing Roswell as the ultimate secret buried in government vaults. The small town of Roswell itself embraced the identity thrust upon it. Annual UFO festivals drew thousands of visitors, complete with parades, alien costumes, and lectures by researchers. Shops lined their shelves with alien-themed souvenirs, from mugs and t-shirts to green-faced dolls. The crash site, once a desolate ranch, became a pilgrimage point for believers and skeptics alike. Roswell had become both a cultural phenomenon and a tourist attraction, its name forever tied to extraterrestrial lore. Music, too, played its part. Bands referenced Roswell in lyrics, using it as a metaphor for secrecy, mystery, or the unknown. Pop culture absorbed the story so deeply that even those who knew little about the original incident recognized Roswell as shorthand for aliens and cover-ups. The case had moved beyond history. It had become mythology. This cultural explosion ensured Roswell's immortality. Even as skeptics dismissed the incident as a balloon crash and believers insisted on extraterrestrial contact, the public imagination turned Roswell into something larger than life. It was no longer just about what happened in 1947. It was about what Roswell represented: the enduring human fascination with the unknown and the suspicion that the truth is always just out of reach. The 1990s revelations. By the 1990s, Roswell was no longer a dusty old tale from the 1940s. It had become the heart of a global obsession. In this decade, a flood of new testimonies, government reports, and controversial footage reignited the debate, ensuring that Roswell remained at the center of UFO discussions worldwide. The 1990s saw the release of several high-profile books and documentaries that claimed to uncover new evidence. Witnesses who had remained silent for decades began to step forward, often elderly and motivated by a sense that time was running out to tell their stories. Some described crates flown out of Roswell containing bodies, while others recalled military personnel warning them to never speak of what they had seen. These late testimonies added vivid detail to the narrative, but also raised questions about memory, reliability, and the influence of popular culture on recollections. In 1994, the U.S. Air Force attempted to put the matter to rest once again. They released a report admitting that the weather balloon story had been a cover, but not for aliens. Instead, officials explained that the wreckage had belonged to Project Mogul, a classified effort to detect Soviet nuclear tests using high-altitude balloons with sensitive listening devices. According to the report, secrecy during the Cold War explained the clampdown in 1947. Later, in 1997, another report tried to account for the alien bodies, arguing that witnesses had likely seen crash test dummies used in high-altitude experiments during the 1950s, their memories distorted by time. But just as the Air Force tried to close the case, Roswell exploded into pop culture again thanks to a shocking piece of media: the so-called Alien Autopsy film. Released in 1995, this grainy black-and-white footage claimed to show military doctors performing an autopsy on a non-human body recovered from Roswell. The film was broadcast worldwide, sparking outrage, fascination, and heated debate, though later debunked as a hoax. It captured the imagination of millions and cemented Roswell's place as the definitive UFO mystery. The 1990s also marked Roswell's golden age as a commercial and cultural icon. The town itself leaned into the legend, with UFO festivals, museums, and tourist attractions drawing crowds from around the world. Television shows like Unsolved Mysteries and The X-Files amplified the intrigue, presenting Roswell as a symbol of government secrecy and cosmic possibility. The crash of 1947 was no longer just an event, it was an industry. In the end, the 1990s left Roswell more ambiguous than ever. The Air Force's explanations satisfied skeptics but convinced few believers. The testimonies and hoaxes added drama but muddied the waters of truth. And through it all, the mystery persisted, reminding the world that Roswell was not merely about what happened, it was about what it meant. In a decade defined by new technologies, global change, and rising distrust of authority, Roswell remained the perfect story, unsolved, controversial, and endlessly captivating. Scientific explanations. While much of the Roswell legend has thrived on mystery and speculation, scientific voices have consistently sought to separate fact from fiction. Researchers, engineers, and historians have combed through the available evidence in search of rational explanations that might demystify the event without invoking extraterrestrials. The most widely accepted explanation among skeptics remains the Air Force's assertion that the debris came from Project Mogul. Launched in the mid-1940s, Mogul was a top-secret program that used high-altitude balloons equipped with radar reflectors and sensitive microphones designed to detect sound waves from Soviet nuclear tests. The unusual construction of these balloons, combining foil, rubber, and lightweight sticks, could explain the strange qualities described by witnesses, including the metallic shimmer and apparent resilience of the material. Critics, however, argue that Project Mogul fails to account for certain details. Witnesses insisted that the material was unlike any conventional metal or plastic, and some described markings that resembled hieroglyphics. Skeptics suggest these could have been misinterpretations of colored tape used in the balloon assemblies. Psychologists note that memory, especially decades after the event, is notoriously unreliable, often shaped by expectation and cultural context. The alien bodies reported by some witnesses have also received earthly explanations. Air Force reports in the 1990s suggested that crash test dummies used in high-altitude parachute experiments during the 1950s may have been misremembered and retroactively tied to 1947. Others propose that the bodies were simply rumors, fueled by Cold War secrecy and the fertile imagination of a public newly fascinated by UFOs. Historians, too, point to the broader context. The military's obsession with secrecy during the Cold War was well documented. Projects ranging from nuclear development to aerial surveillance were often hidden behind misleading explanations. In such an environment, it is easy to see how a classified balloon project could evolve into a story of extraterrestrial visitors once secrecy collided with public curiosity. Skeptics also highlight the lack of physical evidence. Despite decades of research, no definitive artifacts from the Roswell crash have surfaced. No unearthly metals, no alien technology, no preserved bodies, only eyewitness accounts, many of which emerged decades after the fact. To scientists, this absence is telling. If an alien craft had truly fallen in Roswell, the evidence would be undeniable and impossible to hide indefinitely. Yet for all these rational explanations, Roswell remains unresolved in the public mind. Science may provide plausible answers, but belief is not always swayed by plausibility. For many, the lack of certainty leaves room for wonder. And in that space between skepticism and faith, the Roswell legend continues to thrive. Why Roswell still matters. More than 75 years after the Roswell incident, the story remains as compelling as ever. It is not simply a question of whether an alien spacecraft crashed in the desert, but of what the event represents in the larger cultural and historical landscape. Roswell matters because it sits at the intersection of science, secrecy, belief, and power, an enduring mystery that continues to shape how people think about the unknown. For many, Roswell embodies the tension between ordinary citizens and government authority. The conflicting announcements, the rapid retraction, and the secrecy that followed left Americans wondering if they could trust their leaders. In the decades since, Roswell has become a touchstone for skepticism about official narratives, cited whenever the public suspects a cover-up. From Watergate to modern debates over surveillance and classified programs. Roswell also matters because it was the birthplace of modern UFO culture. Without Roswell, the fascination with extraterrestrials might have remained confined to pulp magazines and fringe enthusiasts. Instead, the crash catapulted the idea into mainstream consciousness, inspiring countless books, films, and television shows. It shaped the very language we use when discussing aliens, introducing terms like flying saucer into popular discourse. The case also resonates with deeper human questions. Are we alone in the universe? What would contact with another civilization mean for humanity's future? Roswell, regardless of the truth, forces people to confront these possibilities. The idea that we may have brushed against something greater than ourselves gives the story a spiritual weight, a sense of cosmic drama that transcends mere folklore. At the same time, Roswell remains relevant to science and defense. The debates about what really happened highlight the challenges of studying unexplained phenomena in a world dominated by secrecy. They remind us that genuine scientific mysteries can be easily obscured by misinformation, miscommunication, or deliberate suppression. In this way, Roswell serves as a cautionary tale for how governments handle sensitive discoveries. Ultimately, Roswell matters because it refuses to be resolved. The absence of definitive answers has allowed it to evolve into something larger than history, a legend, a cultural symbol, and a mirror for our fears and hopes. Whether viewed as evidence of extraterrestrial contact, a Cold War cover-up, or simply a story that spiraled out of control, Roswell endures because it speaks to humanity's eternal curiosity about what lies beyond the stars. And so, Roswell is not just about the past, it is about the future, about the questions we will continue to ask as long as the skies remain vast and mysterious. That is why, even decades later, the desert crash of 1947 still matters. The final word. As the decades pass, Roswell's story only grows more complex, more layered, and more enduring. What began as a local incident on a ranch in New Mexico has transformed into one of the most iconic legends of the modern era. It is a tale that has resisted closure, a riddle that refuses to fade, and in that refusal lies its true power. The Roswell incident is not just about what may or may not have happened in July 1947. It is about how people respond to mystery. It reveals the human hunger for answers, the deep need to feel that our place in the cosmos is not a lonely one. It reflects our mistrust of authority, our fascination with the unknown, and our willingness to blur the line between fact and belief. In the end, perhaps it does not matter whether Roswell was a balloon crash, a secret military project, or an otherworldly visitor. What matters is the story itself, the way it has embedded itself into culture, inspired generations of researchers, and fueled endless debates. Roswell has become less about discovery and more about reflection. What we choose to believe, what we fear, and what we hope for beyond the stars. Even now, Roswell is invoked in debates over government transparency, in fictional tales of alien invasions, and in the personal convictions of countless believers. It has transcended its origins, becoming a symbol of the eternal human search for truth in a universe filled with shadows. And so, the final word on Roswell is this: there is no final word. It remains open, alive, unresolved, an echo from the desert that continues to stir imagination across the world. Perhaps that is its greatest legacy, to keep us looking upward, questioning, and wondering what mysteries the skies still hold.